So we are recording today's program, and I will make sure it'll probably be available tomorrow on our YouTube channel. So I'll make sure to send it out to you, so you can maybe share it with a friend or a family member who you think would also really enjoy learning about this topic. So now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for tonight. Patrick Cannon is the author of 6 books on Chicago architects and architecture. He wrote all of these books after retiring from a career as a publicist, editor, and publisher. This is what he does in his free time during his retirement, and we're really pleased to have him. So welcome, Pat.
Okay, before we start, I want to make sure everybody hears. I guess it's working. Well, that's great. That's great. Somebody lived in 1910. The Road has right buildings that have been declared as World Heritage Sites. It's open to the Chicago area building that is included.
The audio is not catching every single word. I think I'm going to ask you to switch microphone.
Okay.
It's like, I think some words are being missed and people at home.
Okay.
So if you don't mind, I will say ideal.
Okay. We can work with this, can't we?
Okay, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
absolutely.
Interrupt
Okay.
you. Hold it up kind of close to your mouth.
Okay. It's not advancing, so we have another problem. Do you have it on slideshow?
There we go.
Aha.
Okay, we got it.
Okay, everybody started out in the Midwest in some kind of log cabin or log house. This happens to be a log house rather than a log cabin. This is the Schmidt-Burnham log house. It's now in Winnetka. Of course, when it was built, there was no Winnetka, and it's now at Hubbard Woods. So it's owned by the Park District of Winnetka. And Schmidt was the guy who built it. He was a German. Log houses typically were built by Northern Europeans because they were used to building with logs. If you go to Scandinavia and Northern Europe today, you're going to find a lot of buildings that are built just the same way there. This is the interior. Now, most of the people who see this building now are young children in school groups, and that's true of a lot of the log cabins in the Chicago area. There's another one in Skokie and one in, I believe, in Naperville and so forth. But of course, everything that went on in the house was around the hearth or the fireplace. So they got warmth and they cooked and they did all the things there. So this dates from the early 1830s, so 1832, 33. Now we're in the 1850s, and this is in Evanston. This is the Francis Willard House on Chicago Avenue, just south of the campus of Northwestern. I went to Northwestern, and I have to confess I never paid much attention to the Willard House when I was there. But Francis Willard was the longtime leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which still exists, by the way, and they still have their offices in the Willard House. Poor Francis Willard did not live to see Prohibition in 1918. And had she lived that long and longer, she would have been very disappointed when it was repealed. She would be doubly disappointed to find out that Evanston is no longer dry. The nice thing about the Willard House for visitors, and you can visit it, is that when she died, they kept the place looking exactly the way it was when she lived there. So the furnishings in the house are pretty much as she had them. The table that you see there with the marble top, I have one very similar to that. And I noticed it, and I did some research and found a volume of catalog pages from Chicago furniture manufacturers. And I found this model table, and there are various variations of it in a catalog from 1876. So that was probably around the time this furniture was fashionable. This is Francis's bed. Francis never married, so it's a single bed, but it's a little larger than a typical single bed. But you can see there's a Wellington desk over there. So even when she was in her bedroom, she was busily working. Now, this is interesting. Chicago, around the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, was largely a German town. And a lot of the brewers emigrated from Germany. They learned their trade in Germany and came over here and started breweries in Chicago. There are many, many examples. We'll see another house by a brewer. This is the Frederick Wacker house. We're more familiar with Charles Wacker, who was his son, Wacker Drive and so forth. The company started out in the brewery business, and then they sort of went over and decided the supply brewers was the thing to do. So they got in the hops business and the malting business and those kinds of things. So by the time Charlie Wacker came around, they were largely grain dealers, and Charles was, of course, a member of the Board of Trade, and that's where he made most of his money. He was also, by the way, one of the sponsors of the Plan of Chicago, the famous Burnham Plan of 1912. So he has another relation to architecture. This is the interior, and you can see the scroll work here. This is the kind of workmanship you were able to get, and a lot of the workmen who came and worked for people like Wacker were themselves German. My late wife lived in Old Town, grew up in Old Town in a German family. You know, that whole area of Old Town was largely German. Now, of course, it's been gentrified. I'm not saying the Germans aren't gentry, but nevertheless, they have different people there. This is from the late 1870s, early 1880s. This is the Wallen House on Dearborn Parkway in Chicago. This was owned when we photographed it by Richard Driehaus. Richard Driehouse's foundation has been very kind to us. Part of the funding for this book came from the Driehaus Foundation. And we had the pleasure of having a tour of this house, which is his private home, a few years ago. And Mr. Driehaus personally spent 2 hours taking us through his own home. Every room is decorated for a different period. So we have Louis XIV, and we also have Art Deco. This room is decorated with things that Mr. Driehaus bought. He's a famous collector. I don't know if you've been to the Driehaus Museum downtown, but if you haven't been, talk about the Belle Epoque and the robber barons. This is a good example of it. Anyway, the panels that you see there, the painted panels, are actually from the Ziegfeld Theater in New York City. When they closed it, they sold off all these things, and Driehaus ended up buying those panels. And the metalwork that you see was salvaged from the SS Normandy, which sank in New York Harbor, was probably set on fire by Germans. Sank in New York Harbor in 1942, and so Driehaus managed to get his hands on that. So it's not only interesting architecturally, it's also interesting historically. This is another room in the same house. This room is furnished in what is known as the Vienna Secession style. Almost everything you see here was designed by Joseph Hoffman, who is an architect and designer. So the furniture, the lamps, and so forth. And this is right at the very top, if you will, of the house. If you remember what the house looked like from the outside. And it's just a little sitting room. So everything in the house has a meaning. Now, not everybody's rich, as we know. This is the workers' housing at Pullman. George Pullman was an interesting character. He made his money raising buildings in Chicago when they were doing the building the sewer system in Chicago. And then he started making railroad cars. So the famous Pullman Palace car, and they could continue to manufacture railroad cars into I think the 60s, maybe even the 70s. But anyway, Pullman was afraid that his workers were being tempted by alcohol and fast women and those kinds of things. So he decided to build a company town, and he did so on the far south side of Chicago. So you can go there now. This is the basic housing for families. And you can see here a typical unit furnished of the period, the coal stove, the couple of bedrooms, one common room, which would have served as dining room and living room and so forth. Now, it's very basic to our eyes, but it was a step up for most people who lived there. Most people did not have indoor plumbing, for example. And although they had to share it, there was a water closet in this house, and every unit had a sink and running water. So it was quite the advance for the time. But of course, if you were a manager at Pullman, you did a little better for yourself. And so this is a typical manager's unit. It's actually a unit owned by the guy who runs the Glessner House Museum. So he's quite involved in Pullman as well. I don't know if that's a bust of George Pullman there. Pullman ended up being one of the most hated men in Chicago, which is going some. When the Panic of 1893 came, and it was more a real depression than a panic, Pullman decided that he had to lower the wages of his employees to weather the storm, but he forgot to lower their rents. So the rents stayed the same, but they made less money. So it resulted, and there were other grievances as well, not just that, in a famous strike where people died, and Pullman, as a result, became hated. When he died, when they buried him at Graceland Cemetery, and that's a place you should go if you haven't been there, the monument to Pullman, his casket is encased in concrete because the family was afraid they might dig him up. Even somebody I hated, I don't think I'd dig him up. I mentioned the Glessner House. This is the entrance to the famous Glessner House at 18th and Prairie in Chicago. It's the only building left in Chicago designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, who maybe in the 1880s was America's most prominent architect. He was certainly an influence on Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright as well. You can see that it's very monolithic, very modern really for the time, even though it's based on Romanesque models. And I put this house here. This is the Hurtley House in Oak Park by Frank Lloyd Wright. About 15 years later, this is 1901. And I always thought this was Wright's homage, if you will, to Henry Hobson Richardson, because it has the same kind of feeling of massive masonry and the same Romanesque arch entryway as well. This is the interior of the Glessner House, the living room, the sitting room. And like the Willard House, the Glessner House Museum is fortunate the family has returned almost all the original furniture. In fact, Bill Tyre, who's the executive director, just I think a couple of months ago, had a U-Haul truck and went to the family's summer property in New Hampshire and hauled some more stuff back. So, by the way, the piano there is a Steinway, and it was chosen for the Glessners, who were one of the founders of the Chicago Symphony, by the original conductor, Theodore Thomas, who was a close personal friend. And so he actually picked this piano out for them. I put this in here. There are additional photographs of this building, of course, in the book. By the way, there are some 90 different buildings in the book. And of course, in the brief period we can only have a selection. But this is the Brewster Apartments from 1887, I believe. It's at Pine Grove and Diversey, just off Lincoln Park in Chicago. And it has a central court, as you can see, and all the walkways and and balconies and balustrades are a glass block. And so there's a skylight right at the top of the building. It's about 12 stories. And so the light comes in, natural light comes from above and comes down, and it provides natural light to the interior. So apartments have natural light on the interior and the exterior. The guy who designed this was Enoch Hill Turnock. He decided he worked for William LeBaron Jenney, as so did Louis Sullivan and others. And he decided that he would go back to Elkhart, Indiana, his hometown, and he became the architect in Elkhart, Indiana. So he was a big guy in a small pond, but he also at one time was the head of the Indiana AIA. So he was very prominent. Now we talked about brewers. I always call this the Dews house, Dewes, but I had a German a few presentations ago. He says, "Oh no, that's the Dewes house." Oh, okay. So anyway, it's the Dewes house. Dewes was another brewer, very successful, as you can see. This is on Wrightwood near the lake. It's as you can see, in very fine condition. It's kind of a combination, I think, of German Baroque and French Second Empire. So it's very eclectic in that sense. This is a stained glass window on a landing. Now, there were plenty of stained glass artists in Chicago and Milwaukee, especially at the time, who could have executed a window like this. But no, that wasn't good enough for Dewes. So he actually went to Belgium and hired a Belgian glass artist who came to Chicago, measured the opening, went back to Belgium, built the windows, brought it back on a ship, and installed it personally. So the rest of the house is just as elaborate as this, as you can see. Now, something a little simpler and a little closer to you. This is Ragdale in Lake Forest, designed by Howard Van Doren Shaw. Now, Howard Van Doren Shaw was a contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright's, almost nearly exactly. But he was better educated, let's say. He went to Yale, and one of his classmates was R.R. Donnelly. So one of his major commissions was the Lakeside Press downtown. And he designed in all kinds of styles, Italian Renaissance, Tudor Revival, Georgian Revival, whatever the client wanted. And he did a good job doing it. But for his own personal summer home, he designed in what we would describe as the English arts and crafts style. So this is the kind of style he preferred, as opposed to what his clients preferred. This is the interior, and you can see that it's very much in the arts and crafts style. American Arts and Crafts is very, very similar to this. Stickley and others did very similar furniture. Now this is, again, around 1900, 1901. This is the Ward Willets house in Highland Park. It's really the first of the great Frank Lloyd Wright prairie houses. It's a very large property. It includes other buildings as well. By the way, Ward Willets and Frank Lloyd Wright and his wife, and Willets' wife, went to Japan with the Wrights in 1905. Eventually they had a falling out. I think if you traveled for any extensive period of time with Frank Lloyd Wright, you might have a falling out. This is one of the interior shots of the Willets house. This is the balcony above a landing. That's a landing between the first and second floors that you see in the distance. And of course, during this period, Wright typically was using art glass for windows and for what we call lay lights, which is what you see there. Later on, he goes to wood patterns and so forth, but at this time, a very heavy use of art glass. Now, this is an interesting house. This is in Lake Bluff. Has anybody been to, what's the name of the farm? Crabtree Farm. Crabtree Farm. Crabtree Farm is an interesting place. It was originally built as a dairy farm by a wealthy North Shore lady back around 1900 or even before. And the first time I knew about it, it was owned by William McCormick Blair. My first wife worked for William Blair and Company, and they had a employee outing up there, which I was not permitted to go to. Blair's house is right on the lake. And then the farm buildings are, half a mile right on Sheridan Road. Now it was then when we photographed it, it was owned by John Bryan, who had been chairman of Sara Lee. And this building wasn't there. He was going through a Craftsman magazine from 1903. He has a huge collection. He's passed away too, a huge collection of arts and crafts, furniture and decorative objects. And in one of the issues, there was this house plan by Harvey Ellis. And he asked somebody, an expert, he said, was that ever built? And they said, no, it was never built. And he said, well, I think I'm going to build it. So this is a 1993 built of a 1903 design. So it's one of the buildings at Crabtree. This is the interior. So a lot of the furniture was also designed by Harvey Ellis, so it's priceless stuff. Other things are from Stickley and so forth. It's not open to the public on a daily basis, as many places are. Generally, groups go there. So if the library group got together, they might be able to make a reservation there. This is an interesting house. This is by an employee, an ex-employee of Frank Lloyd Wright, Walter Burley Griffin, who ultimately went to Australia when he won the competition to design the capital of Australia in Canberra. This is the Peters House, kind of almost like a bungalow, a Prairie School bungalow. It's on the northwest side in Chicago. When we photographed, it was owned by somebody who was involved in the Frank Lloyd Wright preservation. So it's not Frank Lloyd Wright, but anyway, she owned it. Now this is Frank Lloyd Wright again. This is the Coonley House in Riverside. Has anybody been to Riverside and survived? Yeah. Found your way out okay? I was there a couple of weeks ago giving a talk, and my navigation thing got me there and back just fine. But anyway, the Coonley House is 1906, 5 or 6. It was a large estate, really. Again, multiple buildings. And I show this view because it shows Wright's interest in decoration, the integration of forms, so that we have the frieze that you see here. And if you look at the windows, there's a relationship between the frieze and the design of the windows, and also a relationship of the frieze with the interior of the building as well. This is the famous living room at the Coonley House with the vaulted ceiling, the fireplace of Roman brick. The murals on either side of the fireplace were by a fellow named George Mann Niedecken, who worked with Wright on several houses over the years. His company was in Milwaukee, but Wright had him involved in doing murals primarily, and also some furniture manufacturing. This is a little closer to home as well. This is what is now called the Cuneo Mansion, designed by Benjamin Marshall in, I think it was 1912. Benjamin Marshall, of course, famous for the Drake Hotel, the South Shore Country Club clubhouse, which is now the South Shore Cultural Center, and also many of the large co-op buildings in Chicago on Lakeshore Drive. It was actually built for Samuel Insull, not the Cuneo family. Samuel Insull was the chairman of Commonwealth Edison for many years. In fact, he put it together. And of course did well for himself, as you can see. The problem was that when the Depression came, Commonwealth Edison went bankrupt, and they had a more than normal number of middle-class shareholders who lost all their money. And so he became the most famous or the most hated man in Chicago, and actually died on the subway platform in Paris, I think around 1940. So there. This is the interior courtyard. And if you look up, you can see that there's a sort of a greenhouse structure above that. The original idea was that would be retractable, but it just didn't work out. It didn't work very well, and there was a problem with it. So it's fixed now. but there is a drapery that you can pull back and open it up to the natural light. Now, it's now owned by Loyola University, by the way. And unfortunately, they sold off a lot of the land for development. It was originally well over 100 acres and gardens, and well, that's life. Now, this is a building I may have passed many times as a child. In grammar school, we lived in South Shore. And this is the Kenna Apartments on 69th Street in South Shore, a 3-flat, as you can see. It was designed by Francis Barry Byrne, another Frank Lloyd Wright employee. And this is 1916, I think. So very spare and modern, really, for the period. And one of Byrne's collaborators on this building was Alphonse Iannelli, who was a famous sculptor, decorator, industrial designer. He designed coffee pots and all kinds of stuff. And his last major work was the relief of the Rock of Gibraltar on the Prudential Building downtown from the 1950s. So that's his work as well. We couldn't get into this building, and they say that the fireplace surrounds were also designed by Iannelli, but we couldn't get in. This is the Glassner Studio in Old Town. It's secluded on the side street. It's designed by Edgar Miller. Edgar Miller was kind of a jack of all trades, architect, artist, craftsman, you name it. Edgar could put his hand to it and do a good job. And the interesting thing about the Glassner Studio is every room is different. It's kind of like the Wallen House. Now, it's hard to imagine a building code inspector looking at this and thinking that this would pass muster. You probably don't have many staircases ending on a fireplace hearth, but nevertheless, you do in this building. And then this is yet another room, which is sort of an Art Deco thing. Now, we were lucky to get in here. Not too many people have gotten in here, but my colleague, Jim Caulfield, whose photographs all these are, by the way, happened to have a friend of a friend of a friend who knew the people who owned it, and so we were able to get access. This is the Fisher Apartments. There wasn't a lot built in Chicago in the 1930s, understandably, but this one was built. It's an apartment complex, if you will. It's on State near Division. I guess it's State Parkway by that time. Fisher was an executive at Marshall Field, so apparently Marshall Fields did okay during the Depression. You know, the people who shopped at Marshall Fields were not exactly the people who lost their jobs. It's, you know, it's always the poor schmo who works in the factory who loses his job. So he was able to build this. He lived there and then rented out the other units. This is Art Moderne as opposed to Art Deco. Art Moderne strips off the decoration and is basically, as you can see, the use of curves, a lot of glass block, and this is a good example of that. Now, this is another Chicago icon. This is the 860, 880 apartment buildings on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago by Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe came to Chicago from Germany in the 1930s. He was no longer welcome by the Nazi regime. And so he got a job at what was then the Armour Institute, which is now the Illinois Institute of Technology. So a lot of the buildings on the campus there were designed by Mies. This is 1951, I believe. And these are really the model for, I want to say, thousands of buildings around the world. Certainly dozens of buildings in Chicago. Every time you see a steel and glass skyscraper, it owes something to these. This is the first. These are the first. There was nothing like this before Mies designed these. And this is the little house he designed for Edith Farnsworth, Dr. Edith Farnsworth in Plano, Illinois, which is on the Illinois River. Pretty far away. It's about an hour and a half drive from Chicago. It's worth it, though. This would be a great time of the year to see it, but it's getting close to the end. It's the famous glass house, if you will. It really is surrounded by forest and is right on the river. So it is private in the sense that you would have to work a little bit to get up and see in, and there are draperies, of course. The other problem with the house is that it's been damaged severely by flooding. It's on 3-foot stilts, but the 3-foot stilts weren't tall enough. So it's had to be massively fixed a couple times. And recently they've been talking about either moving it to a higher ground, which I don't think is a good idea, or installing hydraulic lifts so that when it's threatened by flooding, they can simply lift it another 5 or 6 feet off grade. But that's, I think 5 or 6 years ago, that was 10 million bucks. It's be 15 now at least. Here's another Chicago icon. This is Marina City from 1968. Bertrand Goldberg, of course, the architect. It's interesting. I worked for the city and starting in 1969 for a couple of years. And I worked at the Department of Public Works as Director of Information. And the Assistant Chief Engineer was a bachelor and given to having parties. And he owned an apartment in Marina City. So I got to go in there and drink martinis shortly after it was opened. I think this is a spiritual descendant of Marina City. This is Aqua by Jeannie Gang. It's in the area of the city called the New East Side, you know, sort of between Michigan Avenue and the lake and the river. And it has the integrated balconies just like Marina City. I think one of the problems, and I live in a building that has these horrible balconies, a lot of buildings have what I call stuck-on balconies. So they're just hanging there and they're not integrated into the design of the building in any way. And Jeannie Gang has found a way to do that very dramatically. This is a very famous house. It doesn't have a person's name. Most houses have the person's name. This is simply known as the Steel and Glass House. It's one of the first modern houses built in Chicago. It's in Old Town. It's on Larrabee, and it was one of the houses that began redevelopment of this part of the Old Town and Lincoln Park. It's by Ron Kruick. Ron Kruick is now with Kruick and I forget his partner's name. Anyway, not important, but they designed, if you're familiar with the Spertus Museum on Michigan Avenue, that beautifully faceted facade, that's another one of his designs. And like so many of the city houses, the modern city houses, the light is always coming in from the inside. So the outside is very opaque, if you will, to passersby. But once you get inside, you can see that there's abundant light. Many of them built around courtyards of various kinds. Now, this is the cutting edge. This is where we're going, I guess. This is called the Net Zero House by Doug Farwell. It's designed so that it has no burden on the environment. And so it has, the roof form is so that the water, instead of going off the roof, is channeled or tunneled to cisterns so that can be reused. And as we'll see, it takes advantage of natural light. I believe it has the heating and cooling system. I forget what they, geothermal, you know, so it uses the earth's cooling and heating. Not everybody can afford the net zero kind of house, but this is the kind of housing that architects are going to be challenged to design and provide for regular folks, multifamily housing, cheaper housing. We're back to Frank Lloyd Wright. This is in Barrington. This is the Frederick House. And I have this because it's a typical late Frank Lloyd Wright house. This is from the 50s. And the public facade of these houses is always very opaque. So the windows are always high and narrow. What we call them clear story windows, so that the privacy of the people inside is protected. But then the rear of the house is where all the glass is. So the people who live in the house have the advantage of the natural view. And so many of Wright houses, including his own home in Wisconsin, are set at the top or the brow of a hill so that you can look out and see the view. And this is a good example of that. Now, not only modern houses, so-called modern houses, are being built. This is a house that was built recently in Evanston. It's a little community just north of the Northwestern campus. It's by Stuart Cohen. By the way, Stuart Cohen would be an interesting guy to have on the program. He's done several books. And he designs in a more traditional style. So most of the houses in the neighborhood were very similar to this. But somebody had put in a tri-level something, which was totally out of keeping with the neighborhood. So somebody bought that, tore it down, and had Stuart Cohen return it to the way it looked originally. And this is the view. There's a public beach between this house and the lake, so nothing will ever be built to spoil this view. And I think we're going to end up back at Crabtree Farm. I mentioned John Bryan. He showed us around, by the way, and this is called the Crabtree Farm Guest House. Now, the design was by John Vinci, who's a legendary Chicago architect, very instrumental in restoring the auditorium, theater, and many other buildings. And it fits in very well with the original architecture of the dairy buildings. But of course, like the Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, the view is away from the public section. And he had this built because he wanted a place for his children and grandchildren to stay when they visited the farm. So wouldn't it be nice if we could all do that? So anyway, this is the last image in our presentation. And thank you very much for your attention. And I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have. Yes. No, I don't. I suspect a couple of million at least. That's part of the problem with the cost of that kind of building, until they can figure out a way to get the cost down. I know I was having lunch with my daughter today, who lives in Elmwood Park, and they're thinking of putting solar panels on their roof because they have a very conveniently south-facing roof. So people are beginning to do it themselves, but that's not going to create a net zero situation. Anybody else?
Pat, can you just tell us a little bit about your interest in architecture, what you studied, kind of professionally, what you did to get to the point where you're able to produce a book like this?
Well, when you get old and you don't forget everything. When I was at Northwestern, I took a course simply titled the Chicago School of Architecture. And that was the beginning. I was an art history minor. I had a major that was promised to make me a rich man. I was an English major. And it didn't quite work out for me, but I had a long career as a publicist and publisher and editor and journalist. So I was always interested in architecture. And then when I moved to Oak Park in 1974, that was coincidentally the year they bought the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio, which at the time was a real mess and had 6 apartments in it. And we began a long slog to bring it back to the way it looked when Frank Lloyd Wright lived there, and succeeded eventually. So I've been giving tours there since 1975. I also gave tours at Unity Temple, although I haven't gone back there. And then after I retired, I started doing tours at the Roby House until I got tired of driving to Hyde Park and not finding a place to park. But anyway, so I was giving these tours at the Home and Studio, and I talked to the then CEO. I said, there's not really a good book about Frank Lloyd Wright's work in Oak Park and River Forest. There's a guidebook that has exterior photographs, and that's fine. Wouldn't it be nice to get inside? And so that began. So the first book was called Hometown Architect, Frank Lloyd Wright in Oak Park and River Forest, Illinois. which has gone through 7 printings. And next year, we're going to do a new revised version. And after we did that, I went back to the publisher and I said, you know, it'd be nice to do a book about the other Prairie School architects. He said, okay. We got an advance. And then then I did the original Unity Temple book. And then he suggested I do a book on Louis Sullivan. And so we did that book. And then we'd always wanted to do a book on interior architecture. So we managed to talk them into doing that book, although I think they regretted it eventually. It cost so much to do. And then we just kept going. So that was, I think we started working together. Jim Caulfield is my partner, really. We started working together in 2003. And so we've been busy doing these books ever since. So
I was going to ask you about your partnership with the photographer. You've worked with him on, I think, most of your books. So
all of my books.
So what's that like, and how was he the photographer? How did you select him or identify that he'd be the best person to photograph these beautiful homes?
Well, it was interesting because I did the first book in conjunction with what is now the Frank Lloyd Wright Trust. And they hired him to be the photographer. So I had no choice in the matter. And we worked together beautifully. And so we've been doing it ever since. Now, he was a commercial and is, at least part-time, a commercial photographer. For years, he specialized in food and fashion, had clients like McDonald's and others. He's now retirement age, although not nearly as old as I am. He still does commercial work occasionally, but his real love is architectural photography. 2 of our books have won the gold medal in architecture from the Independent Publishers Book Awards. And I attribute that largely to the quality of his work. So he's been doing it a long time now, and he knows what he's doing.
I just want to mention, so we do have two of the books on display that can be available for checkout. And the most recent book that we've been talking about tonight is On the Table, which is not part of our collection yet, but you're welcome to take a glance through it. We'll be adding it to our collection at the library shortly, but you're welcome to just take a look at that if you want to before you leave. Are there any other questions from here or anybody at home on Zoom for Pat?
Okay.
All right, Pat, thank you so much. It
You're
was
welcome.
wonderful to hear the stories and to see these beautiful images. And it was just a terrific kind of tour of Chicago homes. So thank you.
It's a pleasure to be in yet another Prairie School revival building, of which there are many. Maybe by the way, the largest Prairie School revival building I know of is the Elmhurst Hospital, which is, you can see it from Roosevelt Road. I guess it's in Elmhurst, but the northern fringe or the southern fringe of Elmhurst. It is a massive complex, and it's a Prairie School revival building.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight.